All right, everyone, looks like we are a couple of minutes past the hour and we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to Modeled Physiology for the Virtual Patient, presented by Dr. Amar Patel and CAE Healthcare Academy Program Manager, Richard Lowe. Just a note that by registering for and viewing today's virtual learning lab, that you agree to receive follow-up communication via email from representatives with CAE. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the online learning section of the SSH website later this evening. If this is your first time tuning into a virtual learning lab, note that these weekly sessions are hosted by members of the SSH Corporate Roundtable every Wednesday at 2:00 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I will now turn the session over to Dr. Amar Patel with CAE.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everyone, for certainly jumping on and spending your Wednesday afternoon with us. Have you ever wished it was possible to create some type of a patient, one that had your idea of a medical ailment and conditions ready for simulation? And what if you could really drive that experience in a physiologic impact, so where you're leveraging the physiology from pharmacology and really representing that in the patient that you're creating. So our hope in this session is to kind of discuss CAE's physiology engine. We do want to present a little bit of the history on how we came to drive that forward, and we want you to understand why it's unique and invaluable for teaching within this new digital ecosystem that we all live as well. This is certainly a moderated session, so we will be leveraging Poll Anywhere for some of the questions that we will be asking throughout this presentation. So I encourage everyone that's on this call to certainly engage with us. We have posted a little bit of the information in the chat as well. And then you certainly see it on the screen. There's multiple ways to be able to engage in the questions. You can certainly download the app, Poll Everywhere. You can certainly go on to the website and just use username CLO Healthcare, or you can text it to us directly, and you'll be able to really participate in the poll questions that we're going to ask throughout this presentation. If you've got questions that pop up as myself and Mr. Lowe are talking, you can certainly add them to the chat, and we'll bring them up in the discussion as we're present, and we may actually have you on mic as well and ask us questions as we go through. But super excited to have you guys here, and certainly excited to talk to you about this topic. As Olivia mentioned, my name is Amar Patel. I serve as the Chief Learning Officer at CAE Healthcare. I joined the organization just hard to believe now, 2 years ago. I've been involved in medical simulation for just over 22 years now. And my background is a little bit of a lot of different things. I moved over to the industry side about 2 years ago, but I grew up on the academic side, as well as did simulations in healthcare, healthcare-based systems, and heavily involved in the research, innovation, and publication side of the world. So clinically, I'm a paramedic by training. I've worked closely in disaster response and critical care transport, actively involved with the Society for Simulation in Healthcare on a variety of different ways. And joining me today is Mr. Richard Lowe. Richard?
Hi, thanks. I echo Amar, thanks for spending your Wednesday with us. My name is Richard Lowe. I've spent 25 years in emergency medical services. I have kind of a unique background. I went to school out in Colorado to basically spend my time skiing, and got roped into search and rescue full time. And through that, I developed a passion for emergency medical services. Ended up teaching wilderness medicine back in New Hampshire for a while, being a street paramedic in urban area in Hartford, Connecticut, finally landing as a firefighter paramedic in rural New Hampshire. And just like all firefighters, you have a side hustle. My side hustle was providing EMS education or medical education for emergency services throughout New England. I had contracts with many hospitals teaching your as I call the alphabet soup type courses. And I was exposed to simulation early in my career and used it like many people had used it with task trainers to develop simulation. And that's through my contracts. I got exposed to some interesting simulators in the back rooms of hospitals and things that people didn't know what they had, and taught myself how to use them, and kind of fell in love with the modeled side of stuff. And in 2010, my wife decided she had enough cold weather, and we moved to Florida. I joined the Medi team, and have been there ever since.
And it's important to point out, Richard's been involved in a lot of the modeling designs, right, for a good bit of time. So what better person to talk about modeling physiology than some of the folks that have been integral involved in some of those developments over the years, right? So we're going to start straight out the gate with the poll question, right? So if you'd like to participate in this poll, just text us CLO Healthcare to 22333. You can certainly download the Poll Everywhere app and just use the username CLO Healthcare as well. And so we're going to open up the first poll. I'm kind of curious straight at the gate where everybody is from that's joining us today. So just take a moment. We're certainly located, both Richard, well, today I'm in Florida, and Richard is certainly traveling a bit as well. I mean, so you're based, where are you today, Richard? Where in the world are you?
Today I'm in Jacksonville, but I'm based out of Sarasota. So today I'm in Jacksonville. Who knows what will happen next week?
So, we'd love to hear where you're from. Certainly, I think it's interesting to see where all things are. And certainly as the evolution of COVID hits us, as we're all thinking about this first or second or third wave, we're starting to see countries open up and close down and shift quite a bit, right? So always interesting to see what is out there and what is available. And then, at the same time, I'm kind of curious out there, are you currently using physiological software for your simulation experiences? Early on in the process, and we'll talk about a little bit of the history. Some folks were using it. Some folks are certainly dabbling with it. Some folks have a hard time with the technology. I certainly grew up in the era of HS6, right, with the original Medimans, and then the original designs of the GOMARD UI, the first HALs that were present, right. And so, I don't know about you, Richard, but where did you start using software? Were you using Physiology when you first started?
So no, I put together, like a lot of instructors did. You had a CPR mannequin, intubation head, an IV arm, put it on a table, and that was your thing. And then you pulled everything kind of your hip pocket and followed a script sort of type of thing. But then as these hospitals would go through this and realize that they enjoy doing simulation, they'd show me their equipment. And the very first one I was exposed to was an HPS. It was in the closet of the hospital. Will remain nameless to protect the innocent here, but on there, and the person that bought it had left and no one knew how to use it. And they said, can you use it? And being a firefighter, I said, sure, give me a couple days. And I got into it and just always been a bit on physiology side, being a rural EMS provider, rural paramedic. I find that it's incredibly important to have a good background in that. And I just really got taken with it. And then I had the same story for the Laerdal 3G, GOMARD, all kind of, fall into your pathway there. But I really enjoyed the physiology in that HS6 environment. We'll talk a little bit about that original software a little bit later, but that's kind of where I got. And since there was nobody to teach me, I really had to dive in and read about it and figure it out. So on there it was pretty good. Only to find myself in 2010 going to work for Medi, it was kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, and we're getting folks from all over the place, right? So Ohio, Tennessee, the UK, Vermont, Alabama, Florida. I think I'm trying to see who wins the Germany. We have so between Portsmouth, UK, and Germany, Oman. Yeah, so that's awesome. So yeah, fantastic. It's evening for you guys too. So thanks for spending the time with us. So it's interesting to look at the poll, right? So we have 58% of the folks that are joined us today are certainly sitting in the yes category, versus roughly the no and the not sure, which accounts for about the 40% of the total numbers, right? So super interesting to see that you guys are actively using it, and we're certainly curious of what best practice sits, and we'll share with you our best practices as we see utilization and growth, especially in these last 8 months. But certainly curious, and would love for if you're up for sharing in the chat a little bit of where you're certainly using the physiology software in your programs applications, because I think we all can learn from what you've learned over certainly your period of time in education. Let's see here. There we go. All right, so we're going to spend a little bit of time of kind of defining and normalizing language a little bit, and I think it's important to be able to define this. So we're going to leverage the Society for Simulation in Healthcare's dictionary. This is the second edition. It is posted online. And they define physiological modeling as that mathematical computation. So it's the study or description of natural objects. And it's governing complex human physiology in a simulated patient case so that you have reasonable response automatically to events inputted into the program, right? So a good example that we often utilize is when I give a dose of a drug, the system automatically knows the behavior of that medication and starts to behave in the same fashion you would see for that. In comparison to the opposite of that, which would be manual driven, right, or manual input, where it's more of that if-then statement, and you're oftentimes driving that. So a great example is that definition on the bottom, where a method of operation in which an operator inputs a value to a given parameter, regardless of what it would be otherwise, right? So if you have a great example would be if a student makes a mistake in a classic simulation experience and gives 100 milligrams of a drug, I'll use atropine as the example, then you're saying, you know what, no, timeout. We don't want the simulator to go down that behavior of 100 milligrams. I'm going to input the parameters for 1 milligram only so that I'm physically making the changes to the simulator as it's driven. And oftentimes we find individuals use run on the fly as opposed to truly leveraging the physiology simply because of concerns of time or not understanding the model. And running on the fly also works really well if you're trying to get quick cases in and out through and through. And we'll talk about some of the challenges with that, but it's simply that idea of running a simulation with minimal planning and preparation. It's more of the impromptu simulation experience. And we do often find some folks leverage running on the fly for every experience they do systematically versus either creating pre-programmed scenarios or leveraging the physiology. And sometimes leveraging the physiology adds time. I mean, as Richard will tell you, if I give a milligram of a drug, you got to kind of, if we do atropine as an example, you got to wait for the half-life of the med to hit full peak before the system will be at 100%. Otherwise, you're not really seeing the true impact of the pharmacological model itself. Anything more to add, sir, to that?
No, that's good. I think that, I believe, everybody's done the run on the fly, whether they made their own mannequin from pieces like I did when I started out, or even if they're using a high fidelity mannequin today, even a CAE mannequin or that has physiology. I think everybody, gets to a point or whatever that goes ahead and runs on the fly. So I think it's when you start to get into that physiology a little bit that things, becomes a little bit of a gray area. And I think that we all can use a little bit of help and understanding as we go through and to be able to utilize that.
Yep. Fantastic. Yep, for sure. So another poll question coming up for you. If you're ready for it, here it goes. I'm kind of curious, are you using pre-programmed scenarios or are you driving simulation on the fly? I'm wondering how many out there are actually leveraging what has been developed by yourself or others or purchased versus actually creating, just impromptu creating something on the fly. And there is a value to simulation on the fly. So don't let us tell you there isn't a value to it, but there is certainly a value to it. So just kind of curious of where folks certainly sit. So we're seeing some folks in the chat using both collectively, and some leaning towards B. We realize there's probably a C answer to this too, which is probably the both that we didn't necessarily put in the survey, right? So yeah, no option for both, but certainly throw in the chat if you're using both. We'd love to hear from you. So I think we're seeing that almost it's a balance. It's interesting. So I'm seeing a lot of folks in the both category and then the pre-programmed as well, right? So certainly interesting to see that. So awesome. Thank you. So, we'll continue to head down this way. So let's talk a little bit about the history piece, right? So just at a high level to give you an idea of where our train of thought is at as we go into this. And so if we go back to the early 1880s and look at the healthcare discipline of the Martha Chase dolls, they were manufactured in 1889 to 1970 by a company by the name of M.J. Chase Company. And it was named for Martha Jenks Chase, who was officially the founder of the company, right? And ultimately created for a toy and novelty element that ultimately turned into a training tool long term. And then we rope into almost 70, 80, 90 years later, we're getting into the to 1960s with Resuscitan, and we've all utilized Resuscitan for a variety of different ways, right? Whether it's for classic CPR training, or we were using it in our program when I was at Wake. We've all leveraged Resuscitan for a number of different things, right? And then late 1960s, Harvey, and Harvey certainly instrumental in a lot of his efforts around mechanical sounds and learning for auscultation. And then we really get into 1969, SIM1, the anesthesia model, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as then further down in 87 with the CASE, the comprehensive anesthetic simulation environment, moving into the late 1980s, the Gainesville anesthetic simulator, which was ultimately licensed to Embody in the 1990s, which ultimately became what we know today as the HPS simulator. And for the brief notion on this on SIM1, right? So it was the first computer-controlled patient simulator between 1966 and 1969. It was developed by Dr. Denson and Dr. Abramson at the University of Southern California. It was wholly focused really on this idea of teaching students intratracheal intubation. And I think this is important to note that we haven't really changed this part too much, right? There's a computer, there's an interface module, there's an instructor station, there's a mannequin, and there's whatever piece of technology that you're leveraging behind it, anesthesia machine, cardiac monitors, or otherwise. I mean, there's all these other components that are present, and that idea really hasn't changed arguably in the last, what has it been, 80 years, right? So, simulation has become, an essential component for education and training, and we're starting to really see that forefront start to pop up in the late 1960s. We have MedSim Eagle, which many of you may not even be familiar with as a whole, and it was developed in Birmingham, New York. And it was really there to present this physiological effect of volatile anesthetics on cardiac output, heart rate, mean arterial pressure, and SVR. And it was really one of the first areas we started to really see the foundational build for physiology modeling to be present, and it was intended to teach those basic principles. It's not a technology that you will see today. Certainly, MedSim still exists today, the company, but I'd certainly be curious if you called them and asked them the question, do they know about their own MedSim Eagle simulator, what their thoughts were. And there's a lot of great folks on this call today that have a lot of history in this experience that will certainly, I'm sure, echo some of these. Go ahead.
I would interject here. I'm wondering how many people on this call today that might have actually used one in some point, right? Because there may be some people here that have used one for it. I myself have never seen one. So on there, we may have thought that might have been a good poll question.
Yeah, for sure. And then moving further along, right, the case simulator, both Dr. Gaba and Dr. Nada developed a full-scale simulator called CASE, specifically to study the decision-making process for anesthesiologists during these critical events, right? So team training, team building, team efforts. I think it's very pivotal to our work even today in understanding the human element and the human integrations for simulation. And that leads us to GAS, right? And following the CASE developments, GAS was created by a team at the University of Florida, and it was led by Dr. Good and Dr. Gravesteins, and developed, which later ultimately became what we know today on the CA side of the house, what you know as a customer as the HPS simulator. And it has started to, it continues to be one of those backbone simulators that has been around for a number of years, and still is that core element to some of our work. If we look at evolution, right, and I mean, Richard, I think both of us were around for this, right? So you have the Medi HPS software, HPS 6, right? It ultimately evolved to Muse, and then ultimately became Maestro. And you want to talk a little bit about the differences between the three platforms?
Sure. So HS6 was the first one that I was ever exposed to, and it literally was it was totally modeled. There was very little overriding. You really had to know your parameters and your variables, and you had to really know where the model went in order to use it well for that. And you created a number of different scenarios within scenarios to have it mimic the things that you wanted it to mimic. And I think for most people, it was a bit overwhelming. I mean, even in the small picture you can see there on the left side of the screen, you had a ton of data being thrown at you, and you really need to know how to move around and move the boxes and set up different things to make it go. And so it was not terribly user-friendly, I would say. on there. Although for someone like me that was into physiology, I found it incredibly fascinating and really, really fun to use. And I still, when I get the opportunity, I like to play with it today for it. But out of Medi, out of that came Muse, and Muse came just as I joined the Medi group in 2010. It came out a little bit earlier, 2008, with their MediMan simulator. Muse basically took the HPS on there, the HS6 software, into the background and reskinned it and gave it a little bit nicer user interface. So it was a really nice way to get people to utilize the physiology. It gave you some overrides, which was nice when the physiology kind of met its match or maxed up against something. And then, kind of allowed the user to have a better experience and for that. And so Muse has been like the platform that we've had for the last 8 years, 9 years, and now we're moving to Maestro. And you can see that there's some, as you look at the two pictures here, you can see that there's a little bit difference, right? Maestro is much more of a graphic user interface. On there, it's a lot more point and click, a little more intuitive, I think. For that, we're giving you back some of the information that we took away in HS6 so that you can put more information up in front of you as an instructor. And I think it's important to say on all these is these are not the screens the student sees. I think that's something that is lots of times, Amar, I think that there's sometimes that people get a little nervous with is they see all this thing and they think, oh my God, the student sees all this. Remember, the student is only going to see what the mannequin reflects or what that, in this case, in the virtual world, what we allow them to see or integrate with. So they don't necessarily have all the information that's there. And I think that's something that's, we'll talk a little bit in challenges a little bit later, but that's something to go with. But I think Maestro really shows that nice evolution where we took from HS6 through Muse and now Maestro. And I'm sure we'll evolve even further, as that time goes on.
Yeah, the underbelly isn't any different though, right? The back end of the physiology modeling that existed in HS6 has been, if you will, refined through the years, but it isn't any different than the core. It is still a true physiology modeling application, right?
Right. Yeah, it's a mathematical model, the cardiorespiratory, and it still has all the same factors. That's kind of why I love going back to the HS6 to look at that. And we have through the years updated it and kind of tune things where we know we might have missed something, the mathematic wasn't quite right, and that goes on to this day where we're still refining and looking at that. So for it.
Well, and so let's talk a little bit more about the models, right? So I think it's important for you to share the difference between MIMO and CISO.
Yeah, so these are a couple books from a couple of statements from Willem van Meer's book on modeling and simulation, and Willem is kind of one of the people that worked on the GAS project, and he wrote a nice book. It's not going to be a page turner by any means of the imagination, unless you're kind of geeky like me that really gets into this sort of stuff. And two things really stand out to me when I think about modeling, and that is the multi-input, multi-output type of model, where you have both fixed and variable parameters that get plugged into the mathematical model, and then they spit out the other side, but more than just one area, right? So you could make a couple of changes over here. It may make 5 or 6 changes on the other end. So that's multi-input, multi-output. And that's more of like human physiology, right, that we have. So if I change one thing in my physiological well-being, let's say reduce my oxygenation, for instance, you're going to see a whole plethora of outputs that tell you that I'm suffering that area. Whereas a single input, single output type thing is an if X, then Y. And so I liken this to like having a slider bar. As I push up heart rate, my blood pressure drops. If I push up my blood pressure, my heart rate drops. It's one kind of followed by the other. And we see that today in some simulators, some very simple things. We see that on some gaming stuff and that sort of thing. And it works. It does what we're supposed to do if we're only looking at those variables. Whereas conversely, a multi-input, multi-output, takes into consideration a host of things, which brings us some challenges to us that we'll talk about a little bit, but it also brings a level of realism that you don't really get with a single input, single output system.
So if we take it one step further, right? So let's talk about homeostasis in the cardiovascular model. Can you explain a little bit more detail on this example of how the changes exist in the parameters and it impacts the baseline physiology that we see present?
So this is kind of a friend of mine kind of did this diagram as to kind of show this and kind of give an idea. And as you look at this, you have deviation from the baseline, in the case of the baseline physiology, and that's set by mathematics. So we have a certain deviation that we can go move up and down, and we're using MAP here, for instance, mean arterial pressure. So as you say, you increase heart rate, then there may be things on the other side that you're going to decrease, like cardiac output for that. And you're going to push-pull relationship between these things. And this is really a true multi-input, multi-output, because I can take one or all of these things and begin to change them, and I'm going to push that map either up or below that baseline. So if you think of that circle as the two max ends of the baseline, as I increase or decrease any of these values, I'm going to start to move that in another direction. But also remember that as I move that in the other direction, the other blue triangles are also going to get moved in the directions that they're pushed or pulled based on mean arterial pressure. So a true multi-input, multi-output type of model. I think they did a good job with this. It's kind of busy, I do agree.
So adding that to notions, that was cardiovascular, right? And so anything
Right.
more on the differences for respiratory on the respiratory model?
So yeah, so that's sort of the same idea. If you take a baseline for this, and we go again, deviation from the baseline. Think of that circle as the max ends of the model, because the models are somewhat finite in nature. As I do different things to that, it's going to push and pull. So as if my O2s, for instance, coming into the system comes up, you're going to see a decrease in respiratory rate. For that, you might see a decrease in the heart rate. You might see all different things. Tidal volume kind of goes down because the model's trying to balance that. It says, hey, I got plenty of oxygen on board, versus the other way, where if we go in a low oxygen environment, we see a heart rate increase and we see the respiratory rates increase. We may see the tidal volume increase with that in order to bring it back to that baseline. One thing I probably should have said in the other one is that the models that we use at CAE, they're always trying to get back to their baseline. They want to come back into balance. So the further you push or pull them out the other side, right, the harder the model's going to work to come back into that, come back to that baseline, unless you've done something in your programming where you've reset the parameters of that circle of where that baseline would be. And I should have mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges you run into in the model design, if you're using a model for any of your education, is when you head down a pathway of no return, right? Meaning that all of a sudden you gave your student, in the system, you gave your student 100 milligrams of atropine, and we're headed down the cardiac arrest pathway. There is no reversal for that. You're letting the physiology play out because you can't fix that. And I mean, and so it's good because there's elements of crucial conversation and debriefing and discussions around med administration that have to happen with the learner. And it's also bad because sometimes you're deviating far field from your originally intended objectives, and you may find yourself having a delivery of bad news debrief versus a core outcome of cardiac arrest and management using bradycardia and atropine as the drug. So, I mean, I guess there's a balance, but I'm with that. I don't know what your experiences with that are, or if there's a way to fix that, because that's often a question we get, right?
Yeah, and I think that part of it is your experience as a facilitator, and I know that, for instance, the example you gave, if the students are really going to take that right turn at Albuquerque, you have to decide based on the objectives of your lesson whether or not you even allow them to take that right turn. It may be time for that timeout, right? And even before they take that right turn, to go there. And so it really depends on where the students are in their learning or educational experience for that. And those are some of the things, and that may be an interesting talk on its own, that we could spend time doing that. So for that, I think, part of that is why do we use that? And part of that answer to your question is that, especially with a developed student, it's nice to allow them to see what happens if they gave 100 milligrams of atropine, right? And so, and that allows for study of the system without real risk, right? Because we're not going to hurt anybody. It's a simulator, right? The worst thing that's going to happen is that we're going to reboot him and start him again for that. So I think that that's really important. That that's one of the benefits of using the model, is it really allows for those things to happen and kind of see an outcome. It also allows repeatability and valid modeling, like validity, because I think probably everybody on this call has done a simulation where they're pulling the information basically from their clinical experience, right? So they're throwing numbers and vital signs out there based on their clinical experience. Well, it's hard to have repeatability and validity with that from one instructor to another. Whereas if you're using modeling and the model runs the show, if the learner does X and all your parameters are the same, well, guess what? It's always going to show the same way. And the only variable in there will be what the students do, which I still think a little bit cleaner as to what they do for that. But also, modeling allows the learner multiple paths to work a problem, right? So, you've got the bolus versus continuous drip. And this is probably one of my favorite things in the model physiology, is that as a clinician, there's more than one way to come at a problem. And allowing your students to be able to learn that and to come out to that. And you could get to the same endpoint for that. And now you can talk about the finer points of why would we want to use a bolus versus a continuous drip, or vice versa, depending on the situation, right? For that. So that's kind of a neat piece on why using that on there. I think the strongest one for me when I was learning this is that if I set the physiology up, right, I didn't spend my time with my nose in a computer chasing what my students did. So it allowed me as the facilitator to really pay attention to the performance for it. And to steal a line from Judy Johnson Russell on there, it's when we're looking at debriefing and we're looking at talking about the simulation, it's always should be around the performance, not the performer for that. And sometimes we get stuck with the performer, i.e. the mannequin, making it do what we want it to do, versus the performance the students are actually doing in that learning objectives for that. As I mentioned, the consistency between operators, if it's set really well and you have a very pre-programmed thing, you don't lose that consistency from one to another. Decision making. Again, we talked about that. Give a wrong dose of meds, they get the visible impact. They actually can see, oh, I did something wrong, right? And they can go on there, and that causal effect and impact can be part of the learning experience. I mean, in the end of the day, we're using simulation to provide an experiential education experience. Use that word same twice there. An experiential education simulation for the students to learn from, because we learn best through that experience. And it really does a good job at that. So, I mean, these are some of the reasons why I personally really like model physiology.
Well, and the causal effect piece, I think, is impactful and important just the same. I think one of the examples we often get is, I'm a sole faculty member. I'm the only one teaching my students. I'm having to run the computers. I'm having to evaluate their performance. How do I do that when a lot of other centers may have an operator and an educator, or may have an entire team? This is where model physiology certainly can help you in the design process, where if you sequentially know the time, the steps as you go through, let the model drive the sequence of events and the change, and allow for the students to interact truly in the simulation experience. At the same time, there's always tricks that you can play out, and some of those tricks are, letting pedal pulses drive the triggers to the next states and stuff, right? Like if I touch a pedal pulse, that's the trigger that automatically makes the transitions to the next state in the model as the model evolves over a period of time. But evolution isn't absolute, and that's one of the advantages in the model, is you can see fluctuations in blood pressure and heart rate. You can see fluctuations in respiratory rate, or ABP, or whatever the other parameters are, TOF or PTC, or whatever else you're looking at, right? And I think that's important for us to understand. There's a huge value in using the model, especially if you're that one man, one woman show at a center.
Yeah, and I think that's, was really my experience at starting out, when I would be shown these things and no one knew how to run them. So, and then it was just me. So, I really don't, that was pounded home in my career on this. And I think that's another reason why I kind of got hooked on the model versus, instructor driven.
So this was just posted. We wanted to share this with you. This was just posted in the latest Society for Simulation Healthcare journal, comparing hemorrhage and human physiology simulation tools. And they certainly compared BioGear's Human Mod and Muse, which is the CAE Muse application, the middle version of the software before we converted to Maestro. And then you saw many of you have used HPS or HS6, excuse me. But the most important element here is the comparison of the different mathematical models and the driving force between the three. And ultimately, there's not one 100% tool that's functional, but equally so, the differences in the models drives that performance. And we wanted to share that there are papers that study the model and the impact the model has, and the fact that the human physiology model that CAE has created is impactful and is significant in contributing towards the goal of creating that physiology modeling simulation experience. I miss anything, sir, on that?
I think that sums it up really great. And I'd love to see more research on the different mathematical models out there, and especially comparing them, because I don't think, to steal Lord of the Rings, there's not one model that rules them all, right? So it really is dependent on what you're trying to look for and what you're trying to do for that. And the model that we've kind of gone with our company in that direction, obviously we like, and that's the one that we like. We want people to use, but we do understand that there's other models out there, and we're always interested in hearing and looking and seeing what else is out there and comparing it through.
Oh, and what works and what doesn't, right?
Yeah.
If everybody has a little bit of something that works, then maybe we need to combine what works collectively to create the best model possible, right? So, yeah. So the $1 million question, and part of this original talk was best practices. What is people doing out there that certainly drives some of these elements? And do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think number one, we just touched on one of the things, and that's the research, right? So there is research on this, and it's ongoing. Sometimes it's a little tough to find, but it's out there. And especially with drug modeling, and of course, we're in a bit of a pickle here. This pandemic has sped processes up, and I would govern to bet that there's a lot of mathematical models out there that they're working overtime here with in the current pandemic, right? As they develop these vaccines, and we look at the different relationships for that. So I think that's a big part here. Predictive analysis in the live environment, I think it's a really nice statement to say that, and I think that it's absolutely true. We have a model, and we know that the model is going to behave in a certain way based on the inputs that we think are going to happen. So we can predict with pretty good certainty how that model is going to behave. And that helps us when we design our learning objectives and things around what we want to teach our students, because we're going to follow a certain path, like we said in the beginning. And that's where you have to kind of get a little bit into, doing the simulation and actually being a facilitator here, because there's maybe times, again, like I said, the right turn in Albuquerque is going to give you something that untoward that you didn't even think about for it. Concept development, I think that's real important, Amar. I mean, I can tell you that I use this once I found the physiologic models, and I was able to bring that into the classroom for my med students, for my paramedic students, helping people to understand physiology. It's a fantastic tool for that on there, and they are able to speed those connections. So when you're talking about complex things in physiology, people sometimes have a hard time wrapping their heads around for it. It's even though we're all people and we have all these great experiences, sometimes we don't know why our bodies do what we do, and it's really a nice way to kind of look at that. I know my kids kind of hate it when I bring it on to them, but it's kind of a nice thing to put on there. And then now we're moving things into game-based education, and I think that this is a great place where we'll have a model that drives that game base behind it on there. And I think that's a really, really, really neat thing. And I know we're moving down into that realm. We'll show some things that we're doing a little bit later for that. And then finally, that adaptive learning digital education, with a good model, and you follow the model, it can integrate with the student to help them find those hidden gems, those parts that maybe they don't quite understand, and then be able to reflect that back to them and adapt to their learning in order to make sure that they have that. And we're obviously using that with some of our digital products and that sort of stuff in digital education.
So let's let's set us up for that next poll, right? I think give everybody a second to be able to kind of gear towards her, because we're kind of excited to show you some of the technology and walk you through each of the model itself. And some of you may have already played with this, but it's a great way to certainly stem a discussion. I think everybody should be ready at this point. So I'm going to hit the go button here. What are some of the challenges that you foresee in using a physiologic model in your educational program? And this is certainly an open-ended question. Richard mentioned, several of these that are present. For me, sometimes there is no go back, right? I mean, I mentioned that before. Once you've progressed down a pathway or a segment, reverse isn't really reverse. The good news is, and I think one of the things are that you have to understand medication, pharmacokinetics and pharmacology, right? And that's oftentimes a gap, depending on who's running the simulation technology, is understanding meds. So do you understand the half-life of succinylcholine, as an example? Do you understand the half-life of atropine or Ativan or Norepi or any other drugs that you're giving that are modeled within the software? And I think that can often be challenging, right? Yeah, all of a sudden we're seeing one here, random acts you cannot reverse unexpectedly, right? Like that's unfortunately, that's human physiology too, right? So that plays a role as well. I had one, Sux is probably the one, we had a residency group of students that were doing simulation, and there was 1,000 flags in this experience, but the room heard 800 milligrams, 800 of succinylcholine, and the dose was 100. And it was a communication and a gap error, and it should have been flagged, right? Read back and repeat. It should have been flagged when we only have 2 vials in the room and they're asking for 8 of a drug. So all these little flags should have popped up, and yet the participants and the students still went down that line. And we ended up giving the meds like they wanted them to, and it ended up becoming a different conversation and a different set of objectives to have with the learners. But certainly interesting all the same.
I like the second one there, responding to wrong actions, a student, especially if drug half-lives, et cetera, mentioned come into play. And I think, Amar, one of the things that we model is a drug half-life, but the other thing that we model is therapeutic index. And I always find it interesting in medical education that we kind of talk about therapeutic index and then we leave it. And then everything is half-life, half-life, half-life. And in reality, therapeutic index is really what we're looking for, right? So, I mean, if we take the therapeutic index of, say, amiodarone on there, and you have to get a pretty high dose of amiodarone before you can hit the therapeutic index, and its half-life is over 30 days, but you have to keep dosing to stay in the therapeutic index. And I think that sometimes when people have challenges with our physiologic model is that they kind of miss that a little bit. And I know we're going to give an example of this a little bit later. So, you're absolutely right. I mean, when responding to the wrong actions of actually a student, if they think of it in a different way and not kind of keying in on the important things of what they're trying to do with that drug, it definitely is a challenge.
Well, let's flip it, right? Let's ask the question. So we talked about physiological modeling. What about instructor-driven models, right? What challenges do you foresee, if any, right? The answer could to this be none, but what challenges do you foresee in the instructor-driven? And one that certainly comes to mind is the amount of work that you as an individual, as an educator, have to take in order to drive the model forward, right? Step by step. So I need to understand what reactions the technology, especially if I'm running on the fly, have to happen. And I need to make multiple parameter changes throughout the way, right? It's not just I give a drug and the physiological model will make everything for me. I've got to think of respiratory, heart, eyes closing, people screaming, things vomiting. Like I've got to think about all those different pieces in this, right? And I don't know if there's any others that you can think of, Richard.
Yeah, so I'll pop on your board there, timely way responding. I don't know if that's somebody or that's something that popped up on there. Is it just on my screen?
Yep, it's there.
But I think that's right on the money, right? If you're the one-man band and you're trying to go through that, you're going to get behind the 8 ball, right? And so when you get behind the 8 ball, things get missed. The mannequin's not responding the way it's going to be, and sometimes we end up throwing up our hands and just say, well, just pretend that this happened, right? Yeah. And that's the last thing you want to do is introduce yourself into the scenario or into the simulation. for it. So I think that's good on there. I think the other, for me, one of the big things is that, you have different educators doing the same scenario, so to speak, or the same SCE as like we say at CAE. And where I get a little bit hinky is that I may throw out different numbers from my clinical backgrounds as somebody else. And what that happens is that, believe it or not, that gives a different simulation experience to every group, depending on who they had for an instructor. And we probably, as educators, that's probably not what we're going for that. So we need to be a little bit careful of that for it. So I think that's one of the things for me.
And we're getting a few others, right? So inappropriately, timely, consistent, a variety of experiences, right? So there's a bunch of different things certainly here that are interesting. And I mean, there are indeed potential issues with modeling, right? And I mean, Richard and I were brainstorming through this, and I think part of it is you have to evolve as the needs evolve of your students, right? And for me, if you've heard any of my other discussions around this, I'm a big believer in moving from a teacher-centered environment to a student-centered environment. And some of the challenges with models is that sometimes the model itself isn't developed for the intended purpose that you're using it for, or the person that's providing the education doesn't really understand physiology and the parameters well enough. Like if I make a change to a baroreceptor, what does that baroreceptor actually do to the body, right? And how does it impact other elements? And so I think somebody mentioned this already. I think you may have been you, Richard. Models can't predict every available treatment or outcome.
Right. I think that's one of the biggest things people would run into is they have this cool model and it's really cool and they get excited about it, and then they quickly find out that there's barriers, right? That the model only goes so far before it gets hinky and on there. And so, as medicine changes, the models need to change. And I think that's kind of the last bullet point here is that says they're expensive to change and potentially slow to change because we want them verified. We want to make sure that they're researched and well brought out. And as we move the new things into the model, we want to try to get it right for that. So I think that those kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, I think coronavirus certainly threw all of us for a loop, right? Because that's a great example of potential issues. Is none of us could have predicted a crazy pandemic, right, in the process. And so let's certainly we want to show you some few examples of this, right? I know we only got a few minutes left in the end here, but so we're going to show you succinylcholine, a vent example, and then we'll show you bleeding out and the impact on our physiological model it has, so you have a chance to really see that real impact. I do want to show you a games-based version of that, and then we'll talk about Maestro Evolve as well. So do you want to talk through this example, Richard?
Sure. So this is succinylcholine, and what thing's going to play here, and we're going to go ahead and give a dose. I don't forgot what dose. What did you give for a dose?
It's 100 sucks on this.
You gave 100 sucks. Okay, so succinylcholine is going to go in. He's going to give it in a bolus on there, and once he administers it on there, then the model is going to take over from there. And you're going to see, if you look at the end-tidal CO2 graph and you look at SpO2 and watch the heart rate monitor on there, you're going to see that end-tidal CO2 graph begins to change for that as the respiratory system begins to change, as tidal volume starts to change, because as the succinylcholine takes effect, the paralysis starts to overcome the body's ability to breathe, and then pretty soon he's going to end up going right down to a flat line as far as the end-tidal CO2. And once that happens, you'll still notice that we still have pretty good oxygenation because he was well oxygenated for that. So he's going to hang out here for a little bit of time before things start to change. And now you're going to start to see that SpO2 that's going to start to drop. And we could actually look at this PaO2 if we wanted to, but you'd see that dropping of the thing. And you can see the response on the cardiovascular side where the heart rate's going to start to climb for that. And we could actually break it even down further and see some of the things that come in there. So this is that respiratory MIMO that I showed earlier. This is where we're seeing all those changes. And as time goes by here, obviously things are going to get worse and worse as it gets down further and further on the patient. And the interesting thing here with succinylcholine is, its therapeutic index, and that point of time, the time that it's actually working is right in the neighborhood, depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 2.5 to say 4.5 minutes in length before the person would actually the paralytic would start to wear off, and he'd start to try to breathe on his own. And we can allow that to happen by going through the whole thing, or we could take the drug out or that sort of stuff here for it. And I know this whole thing takes about 3 minutes tomorrow, and we're running short of time. So I think people kind of get the idea of the challenge or what's happening here for it. But it is neat sometimes to watch this run out, and you'll see that the active succinylcholine there at 1.1 milligrams per kilo, when it drops down to about 0.9, that's that therapeutic index, that therapeutic curve, that's when he's going to start breathing for that. And so it's getting down there right now. We're at 1.1, and
yeah, it'll kick in here in a second, and then we
yeah,
can, there he goes.
There he goes,
reverse.
right around. So this guy came in right around 1, and you can see that he's going to take short little breaths for that, and then his breaths will get slower and deeper, and his oxygenation will come up, and as his oxygenation comes up, his heart rate's going to drop, and you know, CO2 is going to kind of balance out a little bit for that. So kind of, it's a good example of using all the different things in the pharmacology.
So the next one on this certainly is the mechanical ventilator on this, right? So this is leveraging our virtual equipment in the UI software. So if you had a chance to play with Maestro Evolve, you certainly may have been able to see some of this pop up, but we have virtual equipment now with Maestro. And so you'll see this certainly play itself out, where all we did was he's being ventilated on the right-hand side of your screen using our virtual ventilator. And then, you know, as we physically make adjustments to the ventilator functionalities, such as changing something as simple as PEEP, you'll notice the blood pressure, the ABP score on that bottom right left-hand corner will alter, as well as his heart rate. When we change PEEP to 15, he'll do the same as well, right? So there's a lot of potential here, and let's see if it catches itself here. So blood pressure is now 110/70. PEEP was changed to 10, and his heart rate is 78. And there's PEEP being changed to 15. You're seeing it on your screen as the green acknowledgement and the flash of the alarm kicking in there. And blood pressure just changed to 107/76, and you're seeing the fluctuations in the heart rate as well, right? So again, allowing for the systems to link together, because we know that respiratory drives a lot of the cardiovascular functions, and this is back to the MIMO that Richard mentioned before, where there's a causal effect present. And then the next one we wanted to show you certainly is bleeding. You want to talk about this, Richard?
Sure. So I think you said you ended up taking out 2 liters on that. So
2 liters. Yep.
Yeah, 2 liters. So Amar's basically going to go hit the 2-liter button and immediately drain 2 liters out of 6 out of the patient's blood here. And the model then is going to respond pretty quickly for that. You see the heart rate's going to shoot right up. His respiratory rate increases just a little bit for that. And your blood pressure is going to drop precipitously for it. Now, I can tell you right now that when you look at this model, many people are like, well, that blood pressure is so low. How come the heart rate's not higher? Well, remember what I said earlier is that we're bumping up against the parameters of the set model. And this is like a good example of that, is that when you're bumping up against the set parameters of the model. So trying to take him outside of homeostasis for this. So if you were going to be using this scenario, one of the things that I would do is I would go in and change some of those blood pressure baroreceptors on there to allow for a greater fluctuation of his heart rate compared to his mean arterial pressure and the fluid loss for that. So it kind of is, it still works very well. And this is where in the study that we talked about, you know, where with moderate blood loss without changing any of the underlying model, this is where we had one of our stronger points with a mild to moderate type of blood loss.
SimStat, you know, I think the culmination of all of this is that we've been able to take the physiology engine model and include it into a games-based education platform. And so Richard mentioned as one potential utilization structure is games-based education. So this is an example of SimStat, which we did in collaboration with the American Society for Anesthesia, and the physiology model is built into this. So as you're giving medications, and in this case, as you're actually giving oxygen or sedation meds, the model is actually behaving in real time as it would on a real patient, but allows that complete interactivity between the virtual patient and the real human physiology, so that when you're teaching education, it's consistent. You know the expected behaviors that are supposed to be. Your students are learning the right physiology present, and they're able to take something away to know what the outcome is if they do the dosing of medications based on the ailments that are certainly present there, right? So, anything else to add to this, sir?
No, I think that, I mean, it's exactly right. It's kind of like putting it all together in that virtual world. And I think this is one of the most exciting things that we're doing with the model is, putting it into that kind of game-based activity that, it's a serious game. It's, has outcomes, and we can measure people's performance. And I think this is going to be one of the neat things that we'll be able to do with this in the future.
And then we wanted to just briefly introduce also making sure that you had a chance to see Maestro evolve. It certainly leverages Maestro's engine in a virtual patient environment. It is a facilitator. Instructors can develop their own content in real time, so you can still get the gameplay feeling and atmosphere, with that connectivity amongst multiple people all over the world, and it allows for 40 simultaneous users right now. It creates that dynamic environment with virtual equipment, and allows you to actually drive physiology changes as people interact with the equipment in real time on there, right? So, so we're gonna, certainly I'm kind of curious. I think this is our last poll question in the mix. Where can you see utilizing physiology modeling software? Certainly wondering how, what is the potential for you guys to use this stuff out there. We certainly see a lot of benefits, but we want that action to be true for you as well, right? You certainly joined us today because I'm sure curiosity or interest in next steps. I'm certainly seeing ECMO, which is a great example of education and training using physiological modeling software. So there's a lot of potential here for the software itself to be utilized by your teams, whether you're virtual instructor-led, trying to do self-directed, or certainly trying to do in-person training. For us, I've leveraged this as case studies, right? Large group discussions, 100 students in a space. Use the software for case studies. In situ flight sims for absolutely, right? So there's a lot of potential that we can see there. Anything else, sir, that you can think of?
No, I think it's wide open. We can utilizing physiological models could be almost anywhere, and I'd like to see them utilized more in medical education, obviously, than just in simulation, right? So that's something that was near and dear to my heart, is that I was one of those cats that would drag the simulator into the classroom when I was just teaching a lecture on something in physiology, just to be able to show the physiologic responses. And so using it in that way, I think is something you can do for that, getting that baseline education. I don't think it should be left just to simulation.
And so before we, I think, lose everybody, I want to make sure that you have a chance to, plug being out there November 18th at 2 p.m. We're doing a session on sculpting a comprehensive digital ecosystem. How can CAE help you? We'd love to have you join the session. Again, November 18th at 2 p.m. You can register through the Society for Simulation Healthcare is virtual learning labs, or you can just scan the QR code and go ahead and register today. With that, I know that we only have probably about 30 seconds left, but certainly open the floor to any questions that are present as well.
I was answering some in chat as I tried to catch up here. That's what I was trying with my head down, trying to catch up to ones in chat. So
awesome.
I apologize if I missed you or something in the chat.
And if there are no other questions, always feel free to reach out to us if you need anything else. We appreciate everybody taking the time on Wednesday to join us. Our thanks to the Society for Simulation Healthcare for allowing us to share with each of you guys. And Olivia, thanks for hosting.